So we're here for this final session, and this is the wrap-up. Anthony's going to make sense of all of this. I think sometimes a media training, when they tell you that you get a question from the reporter that you don't like, what you say is, well, the real question here is, and then you ask the question you want. So for Anthony, it'll be what these people really meant to say was, and then he'll get to fill in the blank. So we're really lucky to have Anthony with us. He's a climate change and sustainable development advisor at Columbia University's Center for Sustainable Development and Religions for Peace. He's an economist by training. He's worked at the intersection of ethics, religion, and sustainable development. He's a specialist on Catholic social teaching and been an advisor to the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, or I should say whatever its new name is, right? So anyway, welcome, Tony, and we look forward to your remarks. And then what we'll do is we'll just open it up to some general questions at the end and try to end at about 5 for reception.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Walt, and thank you to Georgetown, the Berkley Center, for inviting me. Thank you to Father Drew, who sent me the invitation. It's a great privilege and an honor to be here. I don't feel qualified to do this, but you've put your trust in me, so I'll do it. I just want to give you, it was actually quite difficult. Listening through everybody speak throughout the day, it made me realize there's a lot of great insights and wisdom here today. I have remarks that I want to make, just to kind of give you my own view. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to try and merge the different things I heard during the day. I won't do justice to it all. And then I agreed with probably 95% of what I heard. On the 5% I disagreed with, I will probably say that too, but you'll see how that goes on. So I want to just do two things. I'll start by talking a little bit about the general issue of the moral imperative to address climate change, both globally through the Paris Agreement and here in the US domestically, since that was a major priority of the day. And then secondly, I will move over to specifically to Laudato Si, which is an absolutely magnificent document, magnificent in 2015 in terms of its impact on the Paris Agreement and raising consciousness generally on climate change, but also magnificent for a church that thinks in centuries, because in my view, this is the single most important encyclical since the beginning, since Rerum Novarum. And I think I'll kind of try and explain why that is, though you probably all here know why that is already. I don't need to go into the science and economics of climate change for this group, because you all know that really, really well. I'll merely just point out the basics, that it is probably the greatest, one of the greatest, if not the greatest moral crisis of the 21st century. The Lancet, the top medical journal, has called it the greatest public health crisis of the 21st century. The Nick Stern, one of the most prominent climate economists in the world, claims that the costs of climate change will far outweigh the costs of the 2 world wars and the Great Depression combined. And a recent study in Nature suggested that it could destroy global output by about 25% by the end of the century. So an economic crisis like we have never seen before if we keep on this current track. And of course, like everything else, not everybody will be affected equally. It will be the poor who will be affected hardest. Poverty and inequality will rise dramatically. Even by 2030, which, let's face it, is just around the corner, it's before the major impacts hit, the World Bank claims that approximately 100 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty from climate change just by 2030 alone. So all the gains that we're making in reducing extreme poverty with the Millennium Development Goals, and there have been great gains, could easily be wiped out simply from climate change. Climate change, it's hard to judge the number of deaths from climate change each year. One of the best estimates I've seen is around 400,000 a year, though of course if you add in the deaths from pollution, people just dying from the fumes from fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, that's around 5 million people a year. So climate change is a paramount pro-life issue. Unfortunately, in the US, it's not considered such, but it is absolutely a grade A pro-life issue. This morning's panel was very much on the security dimension of it. And this is something that, is very clear to me, and some colleagues in the Earth Institute have done a lot of work on this. Even though the Syrian war, which we've talked about, is very much on the news, everybody except Gary Johnson knows what Aleppo is. And the horrible, absolutely awful human suffering that's going on there. But you never hear, this Syrian war had many fathers, but one of those fathers was the worst drought in Syria between 2006 and 2010 in at least 900 years. Some people even say all the way back to the beginning of agriculture at the Fertile Crescent. Hello, Gilgamesh, right? This is how bad this drought was. We know that 85% of herders lost their livestock, 75% of farmers lost their crops, and 1.5 million people were displaced due to this. Of course, another father of the Syrian crisis was, and this is the US-engineered war in Iraq, which caused another 1.5 million refugees to come in right at the moment when Syria couldn't handle it. So we need to think about, when we talk about the refugee crisis, I think, it's going to get dramatically more worse. And the two major drivers of refugee crises are environmental factors and war. So we need to start thinking about those two issues too, and to take the injunction very seriously of the church, not just to take climate change seriously, but to really take what Pope Paul VI said back to the United Nations, 1965, war never again, no more war, because this again is one of the main problems in these drought-prone regions, because let's face it, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about the Sahel region of North Africa. It was Cardinal John Onaiyekan of Nigeria who really brought it home to me that what you have going on is, with the drying up of Lake Chad and the encroaching desert, the pastoralists are bumping right into the farmers. The pastoralists are mainly Muslim, the farmers are mainly Christian. Boom, there's your problem. Again, when we hear about Boko Haram and what's going on in Nigeria, or when we hear about Al-Shabaab on the other side of the continent, for some reason, the media in this country doesn't want to tie it to environmental threats, but that's really, really at the heart of it. So when we think about the refugee crisis, which is the most severe refugee crisis since the Second World War, and it's mainly been driven by, once again, war, but also by environmental threats. So that's basically the background as to why it's so important, why it's such a moral issue. And of course, the solution that we have all endorsed is the world of 196 countries has endorsed the Paris Agreement, which again, you all know what the commitments are there. The commitments are not as strong as they should be, as we would like them to be. They're based way too much on voluntary national plans. So it's all about, it's very much a basis of please trust me. Though, of course, there are some mechanisms built in to the Paris Agreement whereby countries every 5 years are supposed to come back and ratchet up ambition. And there's a peer pressure mechanism built in to help them do that. But basically, for the Paris Agreement to work, you need to reduce emissions by around 80% by 2050. And then you got to get it down to practically zero by 2070 or 2080. Now, this is a transformation of the global energy system, the likes of which we have never, ever seen before. It's extremely hard, it's extremely difficult, it's extremely challenging, and it's not surprising that people are scared and worried and really anxious about what that entails. Now, in the US, the Obama administration has signed up to this goal, and its current plans, which Hillary Clinton has endorsed, would indeed get you to, they would claim they would get you to, it's like reduce it by 26 to 28% by 2030, which is consistent with a longer path to 2050 of 80%, or so they claim. But the big problem there is, the fear is that it's relying too much on the easy gains of switching from coal to gas. And yes, gas is much cleaner than coal, but it's still a fossil fuel, And once you invest in gas, it's really hard to uninvest down the line, and we don't have much time. So that's a real problem. That's a real problem here. The good news is that we have both the technology and the financial means to do this. It costs, the International Energy Association agency said that it will cost around $40 trillion to do the energy transition over the next, between now and 2050. That's around 1% of GDP a year globally. And some researchers at Columbia University for the US have argued, how do you price the US commitments under the Paris Agreement? And they came up with a range of between, what's the numbers, 42 billion and 176 billion a year. For all of us sitting in here, they're really big numbers, but actually in terms of the US economy, they're not. They're under 1% of GDP. This is a comparison. The US military spends 600 billion a year. So we have the money, we have the resources. It's just how you want to spend it. And one of our colleagues told us that, the Iraq War and its aftermath and everything else cost $5 trillion since 2001. Think of how much accomplishment we could make, not just towards the energy transitions, but towards the whole sustainable development agenda if we would only start spending money for peace rather than for war. On the technology side, we're undergoing a renewable energy revolution. Last year in 2015, 90% of new electricity generation came from renewables. Now that's a very fascinating number, but of course I'm saying new. Most of the stuff that's currently out there right now is still very much based on fossil fuels, and there are a lot of new coal plants being built in many parts of the world. And as one of our colleagues said, in South Africa, and I've heard this in India too, they will basically say, look, we can't afford to invest in renewables right now. Coal is the cheapest, and we need to do it the cheapest way because we don't have the money, which tells you there's a moral obligation for the rich world not just to take action on their own to reduce their carbon emissions, but to help their poorer neighbors do so because, it is a global common good. So that's, what we need. That's kind of the landscape of where we need to go. So why is there such a problem? Why aren't we doing it? Well, one reason, as I've mentioned, is the universal instincts of fear and uncertainty and anxiety over a scale of change so large, and also a scale of change that doesn't move very quickly. So it takes a long time. And a lot of the people most opposed to climate change, won't mention any names, but think of certain political candidates who are around 70 years old. They'll be dead by the time the worst impacts of climate change come along, right? It's their children and grandchildren who will really feel the effects of it. But I think, the way I think about it, and this is just my personal view, and feel free to attack me on this and criticize me, but I think in the US there's a trifecta of issues going on, what I call ideology, theology, and money. The ideology is the US fascination with libertarianism and the view that we reject all forms of collective action that threatens individual freedom or second guesses free market outcomes. But this is shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because even if you're a big believer in the power of the free market, climate change, as we all know, represents one of the single biggest market failures out there because it is not pricing the social costs of using fossil fuels, and those social costs are massive, which amounts to an implicit subsidy. In the US, that subsidy is around 4% of GDP each year. Globally, it's around 6.5% of GDP each year. So that's a subsidy. That's corporate welfare for libertarians who like that language. The second reason I think is just bad theology. It's the idea of American exceptionalism that says, America is endowed with bountiful natural resources that God gives us the right to use. You'll see this a lot, especially in many of the evangelical churches, that a subspecies of American exceptionalism is climate exceptionalism, because the average American emits 17 tons of carbon dioxide each year. The average European emits only 7. The average Chinese person also emits around 6 or 7. Now, this never comes up into the public debate. If you had an earnest public dialogue, a kind of a real Aristotelian public deliberation about the common good, this would come up, but it never comes up. It's something that people prefer to avoid. And I think it's because it's for too many people, it's considered a birthright. The third problem is money, and I think this is the most important problem at all. This is the avalanche of money thrown at it. Think about this. If you look at the math of climate change, this is from Bill McKibben. Some of you might know this. If you want to stay under 2 degrees, as the Paris Agreement says we must, that means that 80% of all the oil, gas, and coal reserves on the books right now cannot be used. We can't use them. That amounts to about $20 trillion. The energy companies are the most powerful and wealthiest companies in the world, and they are not going to give up $20 trillion without a fight. And therein lies the problem. And in the US, they have an inordinate amount of ability to influence politics and influence the political debate. I've heard many people tell me that if you talk to Republicans behind closed doors, they will admit that climate change is a problem and a serious problem, but they can't say anything about it because they'll be killed with their donors. This is a real, huge problem. And of course, and you have a media which pretends that there's actually a debate. It's like, who made the joke that says if somebody came out one day and said, I believe the earth is flat, CNN would have a headline would say, opinions differ on the shapes of the earth, right? But this is the media landscape we live in, and we're seeing this quite clearly in recent weeks on all various topics. But then, so if this is blocking political action, this blocking political urge, this is where I think the moral voice is important. We have the scientific solutions, we have the financial solutions. What we lack is the political will and the political courage for all these reasons. And this is why I think the moral dimension is the most singularly important dimension of this whole debate, because it has the ability to unblock this inaction. Now, before I get to Pope Francis, I will say, and other people have said this, that this is not a Catholic issue. Pretty much all of the world's major religions are united on this. Somebody mentioned about that religions can be divided, and yes, they can, but not on this. This is something that really unites all religions. And I had the privilege of working with Religions for Peace. And in April 2015, we did this great symposium at the Vatican where we invited some of the world's top climate scientists and some top religious leaders, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, Jewish, Hindu, both schools of Buddhism, Sikhs, all came to one room. And what really struck me, as someone who knows a fair amount about the Catholic social tradition, but very little about the other social traditions, is they all said the same thing in their own language. In other words, we human beings have a duty to care for the earth, to care for creation. Now, the Buddhists won't use the word creation, but they will affirm nonetheless what that means in terms of caring for it. We had some wonderful leaders from all across things. That meeting, by the way, was hijacked by some of our friends at the Heartland Institute and Breitbart, who were funded by you-know-who sent a delegation to Rome to educate Pope Francis that climate change is a fraud and he needs to know the truth. But, you know, it was great because our little meeting, which nobody would have ever paid attention to, suddenly made headlines because media loves conflict. So thank you, Heartland Institute. Thank you, Breitbart. We're definitely in your debt over that. So all the major religions. And it was very clear, and as other people have mentioned, that Laudato Si had a major impact on COP21. Many country delegations mentioned it. But I would say not just Laudato Si, because last year we had statements issued by our Jewish friends, the Muslims, the indigenous, the Hindus, the Buddhists. They all got together. And I would say, following the action of Pope Francis, they basically said, all right, well, okay, Pope Francis has said something. We need to step up our game now and move. And they did. And this had a major impact. And we at Religions for Peace, we had a global Faiths for Earth campaign headed by Desmond Tutu. and we got around, I think, 330,000 signatures. The Global Catholic Climate Movement got 1 million signatures. They beat us, so the Catholics beat us on that. But overall, I think there were well over 1 million, 1 to 2 million signatures handed in to President Hollande in Paris during the negotiations. And this was noticed. This was definitely noticed. And I also think that when Hollande, for fear of terrorism, cancelled the climate march in Paris, so they decided they would have a virtual march, and so they all left their shoes. So seeing the image of Pope Francis beating up old brown shoes on the street, that was an incredibly powerful image. And I think that was, again, way more powerful than a climate march, which which are a dime a dozen at this point, right? And Pope Francis wouldn't have done the climate march, obviously, but his shoes there sent a very, very important message, and certainly that I will never forget that image. So, but what are the main moral arguments? I think there's at least 3 moral arguments when it comes to climate change that would transcend the kind of all the religious and ethical traditions. I think one is the simple point of that we are all oriented toward human flourishing. All religions affirm that we are all summoned towards a version of human flourishing across all dimensions. Catholics refer to it as integral human development, but other religions would say similar things. And that flourishing depends crucially on the web of life and the biodiversity on this planet that sustains us. So if we're destroying that, we're destroying the conditions for flourishing. Therefore, you get a self-contradiction. So there's moral argument number 1. I think moral argument number 2 is what I call the Spider-Man argument. With great power comes great responsibility. In other words, if you have the capacity to deal with a problem, you have the responsibility to deal with it. You know, if there's an earthquake, we're not responsible for the earthquake, so there's nothing we can do. We're not responsible for people who die. Well, maybe if you build shoddy buildings, you are, but you know, most of us aren't. But if we are responsible for it, if we can do something about it, we have the responsibility to do something about it. And then the third related point is, you know, it's the poorest who suffer most. And again, all religions will affirm that, you know, if the poor are close to God or need to be valued, loved, cared for, and affirmed. And as we know, one of the statistics I quote all the time is that the bottom 3 billion people on the planet account for only 6% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So they are really suffering for the sins of the rich. And when I was at the Vatican just 2 days ago, one of the most powerful speeches was by Cardinal Charles Bo from Yangon in Myanmar, one of Pope Francis's new cardinals, who basically said that what the rich are doing to the poor with climate change amounts to criminal genocide. Criminal genocide. Now it doesn't get a more powerful statement than that. Now, if you go back to Gaudium et Spes, the famous chapter 27, which lists the infamies, you know, war, genocide, abortion, you know, all these things. I would say today, if they were writing chapter 27, maybe they would put climate change in there too, because of what it's doing. This is a great moral infamy, and therefore it rises to a top priority moral challenge for where we are today. So I don't want to go on forever, so let me talk a little bit about Laudato Si, since this has kind of consumed me since it came out last year, and actually before it came out. And I've worked a little bit with Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace and Cardinal Turkson, also with the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences on Laudato Si. And 2 days ago, I had the enormous, like one of my lifetime achievements of shaking hands with Pope Francis. And of course, if you ever, I don't know, some of you here have probably met the Pope. I'm sure you guys have met the Pope, but I had never met the Pope before. And of course, I felt like, you know, you'd think, what would I want to say to Pope Francis? And what happened was they were trying to move the line along. So Cardinal Turkson says, push me forward and just say, shake his hand and move along. So I'm like, tongue-tied, and my first thing is like, oh, Eminence, no, Holy Father. And I just said, oh, thank you for Laudato Si, it's so wonderful, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really sure, and he's probably thinking, who is this idiot? What's he blabbering about? but he's just, I'm not even sure how much he understands English actually, but he just kept on saying, thank you very much, shook my hand and moved on. But it was such a great, great joy to be able to actually meet Pope Francis. But I think the way I look at Laudato Si, and I loved Father Augusto's talk today, and it very much, the way you think about it is very close to the way I think about it. And the way I think, I think it's all about what I call the connect, disconnect, reconnect thing. It's very close to the See, Judge, Act way of looking at it. I think what Laudato Si is saying, there is a fundamental and deep connection between human beings and the natural world and among human beings themselves. That comes through with the notion of integral ecology, the idea that the relationship between us and the natural world is interconnected, inseparable, and all part of a larger whole. So, how we affect the earth affects how we affect human beings. Very obvious with how the poor are affected by climate change. But it's way deeper than that. Because when he talks about the environment, he's not just talking about climate change. He's talking about a whole lot of things, pollution, biodiversity, water stress. In fact, the scientists talk about the 9 planetary boundaries. And even though Pope Francis doesn't mention the term planetary boundaries, I actually tried to count, and I actually think he gets most of them. Because the planetary boundaries, I think, are, I'm going to look now because I'm never going to remember them. The planetary boundaries are climate change. They are ocean acidification, overuse of freshwater resources, land use changes from deforestation, things like that, pollution from fertilizers, which interferes with the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, ozone depletion, chemical pollution, airborne pollution from fossil fuels that kills all those millions of people, and their loss of biodiversity. Now, I think Laudato Si mentions all of those issues, and the scientists tell us that if we trespass these vital boundaries, we are moving beyond our kind of safe operating space of this period we call the Holocene, this 10,000 years of kind of Garden of Eden period that enabled human flourishing, into a world that's unpredictable and dangerous, and we have no idea whether we're going to survive it or not. So that's, the issue, that we are connected to these natural rhythms of the earth. And if we just trespass them, we're in deep trouble. But I also think he's saying that we're also connected to each other. It's less obvious, it's less to the fore, but it's still a theme that runs through Laudato Si. The ancient idea that we are social animals who find meaning and purpose only through relationship with others. I mean, this goes back to the old virtue traditions of Aristotle and Confucius. Of course, it's fundamental to Christianity and most of the world's religions too, that we are relational creatures. The Catholic social teaching says we are relational beings. We are not autonomous individuals. We mirror the life of the Trinity, not this random atoms. But, this is a common tradition, and the science actually tells us that people are altruistic and pro-social, even though they can taught to be otherwise. So if you violate the planetary boundaries, you can also violate what I would call the boundaries of exclusion, whereby, with all this, in the middle of great plenty, poverty, hunger, and just great deprivation of health and education and energy access, and water and sanitation, all these great things, and Pope Francis says very clearly that this leads to violence and social dysfunction, because that's not the way we're supposed to be living. So that gives rise then to ethical responsibility to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, which many people have said, the interrelated cry, and that gives rise to the rights of the poor and the rights of the earth. That's a little bit radical. I mean, the rights of the poor we've already heard. That's your preferential option for the poor. Pope Francis said that very clearly. And in one of my favorite speeches, by the way, his speech to the popular movements in Bolivia in July 2015 is an amazingly powerful speech. People call it a mini encyclical. I recommend that. And that's where he said very clearly that, the equitable distribution of the fruits of the earth and of human labor is not philanthropy. It's a moral obligation. And for Christians, it's a commandment. So That's, that's the preferential option of the poor right there. The rights of the environment he actually mentioned in his UN speech, which was a little new. He didn't use that term in Laudato Si, but he says the environment also has rights for two reasons. One is because we are interconnection, because we are connected with the earth. When we hurt the earth, we hurt ourselves. And second, and again, as many people have said today, because the creation, all creatures have inherent value in their own right that goes beyond what we do to them. Therefore, they have rights too. It's quite radical. I'm pretty sure if somebody had said this a few years ago, they would have been told that that doesn't really work in Catholic social teaching. But guess what? It does now. So because of this, we have, instead of a connection, we have a disconnection. And I think the most powerful analysis of Laudato Si is the diagnosis of this disconnection. And Pope Francis, his main diagnosis is what he calls the technocratic paradigm. And again, many people have mentioned this. Many people have criticized the utilitarian mindset. Pope Francis actually said, the technocratic paradigm is when you judge all economic interventions and interactions solely in terms of utility, efficiency, productivity. You have no concern for any value or dignity in either people or in creation. That's all you care about. So what you're doing is, if you want to get a little bit philosophical about it, is for thousands of years, people thought about what are our ends, the teleological view. What are our ends? What's our purpose? We don't ask that question anymore. We just talk about the means. Or in other words, the means become the ends. So in other words, extraction becomes the goal. Getting as much value out of this person, or getting as much value out of this land, is the goal, with no concept of what's the greater meaning to all of that. Now, I actually think that he's actually making a very radical critique of Enlightenment area philosophy here, in two ways. He's actually saying that, what are the two pillars of the Enlightenment? One, the idea that you can take science to gain knowledge and control of nature for the betterment of humanity. Pope Francis talks about this in terms of, possession, mastery, control, domination, treating it simply as an object, as a formless mass that you can do what you want with it. The second pillar of the Enlightenment is the exaltation of individual freedom for its own sake, completely divorced from any view of a good, and God forbid any notion of a common good. Now, pretty much every philosophy since the Enlightenment has been based on one or both of those pillars. Libertarians are obvious there, but also I would say utilitarians also reject the idea of the common good, and all kinds of expressive individualists, what Michael Sandel calls the unencumbered self, the dominant modern view, which I really think Laudato Si is criticizing. And you can see this very clearly in my own discipline of economics, because neoclassical economics emerged with some very dubious assumptions. One, self-interest. Two, you're only concerned with maximizing the satisfaction of your personal subjective preferences. So they're material preferences, so you don't value anything, you don't value relationships, you don't value nature, you don't value human development in any non-material dimension, and you don't question what these values are because you are the king of your castle. There's no value judgment, there's no form of self-improvement or ethical education. You are what you are, you like what you like, and your goal is to maximize that. And of course, the market is valued to the extent that it's able to maximize the satisfaction of these subjective material preference. That, in neoclassical economics, is why the market is valued. Of course, there's a whole bunch of heroic assumptions to get to that result. But even if you grant those heroic assumptions, you have to ask, really, that's why the market is valued? And I would submit that this lies behind Pope Francis's very strong criticism of the market economy. It's not criticizing a market. A market is just two people meeting and exchanging for mutual benefit. That's been going on since the dawn of civilization. But the system we have today superimposes all these ideological assumptions on top of it. Materialism, greed, and I'm sorry, but social norms are malleable. If you tell people that the virtues are greed, materialism, competition, people will start acting that way. People will start acting that way. That's just human nature. So, so this, I think, lies behind the idea of what Pope Francis is calling the myths of modernity. I think somebody else mentioned that. Grounded in a utilitarian mindset, individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, and the unregulated market. And I'm going to, because I can't resist, I'm going to give you my favorite Pope Francis quote from that Bolivia speech. Let us say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality where money rules rather than serves. That economy kills, that economy excludes, that economy destroys Mother Earth. And he's talking about the economy we are living in today. And, it's not just all negative. He's not just a Debbie Downer. He has some very prescriptive elements too in terms of what he's asking for. What he's asking for is integral and sustainable development. Now, we know what that means. We know what integral development is as Catholics. It's development of the whole person and every person. We know what sustainable development means because the world has endorsed it last year, just like they endorsed the Paris Agreement. Sustainable development involves the 3 pillars of 1, economic development and poverty reduction, 2, social inclusion and abolition of all deprivation, and 3, care for the earth and the rhythms of nature and biodiversity and land on earth and land on water. That's sustainable development. Some people mentioned economic growth. Laudato Si actually says a bit about that. He said, for the richer countries which have relied on this consumerist mentality, maybe you need to get used to lower growth or no growth. Think about that. That's radical. But for some of the poorer countries, they will still need to grow. And he says that because, it's only a matter of justice that they converge in their lifestyles to the richer countries, right? That's a matter of justice. But the richer countries like the US, do you really need, we need to start to think about this fetish with economic growth, which really comes from the technocratic mindset, because it's the only way we've been taught to think about progress, right? But it's a very narrow way of thinking about progress. Some people mentioned, the different values. I'll point out that my colleagues did this index of sustainable development goals and where each country stands relative to sustainable development, ranking the countries. Where do you think the US falls on that ranking? 25, right? Ranks number 25. Now, if you're an African country, 25 would be a great ranking. But for a country as wealthy as the US, it's a pretty bad ranking, I would say, because it does very poorly on issues such as social inclusion, inequality, and poverty, and issues along those lines. So finally then, how do we get this kind of reconnection? How do we reconnect with among human beings themselves and among human beings with the earth? And I think that Pope Francis argues that we need to habituate the virtue of solidarity, which is the idea that we're all responsible for all. But he has a very expansive notion of solidarity. The idea that solidarity extends beyond our immediate circle to the whole wider world is an old idea in Catholic social teaching. It's very strong in Gaudium et Spes. Pope Francis, of course, talks about that, but he also talks about solidarity across time as well as space with future generations. He talks about solidarity across species with the whole of creation too. So it's a very expansive notion of solidarity. And it goes back, and I'm going to repeat, one of the earlier speakers talked about the virtue tradition. She didn't say virtue, I think she said characteristics or something, but they're virtues, so I'm going to say virtue. Prudence, justice, moderation, compassion, humility, cooperation, and courage. That's a great list. That's a great list. And, so to reconnect with who we are truly as human beings, which all major religions will say, involves kind of habituating these virtues or habits. Because as Pope Francis says, virtues are infectious because good habits in one person can encourage good habits in others. Like I said, social norms are malleable. They're malleable for good or for bad. So we should try and make it for good. So hence the importance of ecological education and role models and why this is so important that, religious people in particular speak out so forcefully about this is because that's how you change minds, that's how you change social norms. But of course, and as other people have said, very, very important point, individual self-improvement is not enough. You cannot solve complex social problems with individual virtue alone. You also need social virtues. You need to change your structures and institutions that are impeding virtuous action. The things I've talked about, the economy which is mired in the technocratic paradigm, the politics which is stuck in the mud because it's too terrified of electoral politics or financial interests to do anything. All of these big issues in the global economy today. So this is our big challenge. There are many different levels of action when you twin solidarity with subsidiarity, because since the climate is a global common good, then the natural domain is at the global level, hence the Paris Agreement is the right way to do it. But implementation must be at the domestic level. You also need a conversion, not just of politics, but also of business. Because, let's face it, in Catholic social teaching, the point of, and most people in the world, in the country today, have this view that business is about making profits. As long as they don't break the law, they're okay. If they break the law, maybe we have a problem with you. But maybe, even there, maybe not. Because, you're supposed to be making profits. That's what you do. And if there's any problems, well, then the government will step in and pick up the pieces. But that's not the way the Catholic teaching sees business. It also sees business as oriented towards the common good just as much as the public sector. And there's a great document the Vatican put out called The Vocation of the Business Leader, which spells that out in great detail of how you do that. But Pope Francis said, business can be a noble vocation, but to do that, it has to orient itself towards the common good. He gives two examples. One, employment over profits, right? Hire people, because employment is a core dimension of human flourishing and meaning and purpose. And two, investing in sustainability. He actually said that, business is only ethical to the extent that it pays for the use of shared economic resources. By that definition, I wonder how many businesses would actually be considered ethical today. He also is very critical of financial interests who try to manipulate, mask the problems and conceal the symptoms, who manipulate information so that their own plans will not be affected. We all know in this country certain industries and certain lobbyists who fall into that category. But, we need a conversion of business too. They must be part of the solution. They must be part of this noble vocation. And I'll end by saying, I'll end on this point. He claims that, how can we force this change? How can we change these social norms? How can we get this conversion in our institutions as well? And, he mentions one thing is we can do it through consumer boycotts. We have the power to withhold our business from businesses that misbehave when it comes to the environment. It's very successful. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the civil rights movement here in this country used those tactics very well. In both cases, religious leaders were to the fore, which is why I'm a great fan of things like fossil fuel divestment and other ways of making companies morally accountable for moral decisions, because as Pope Benedict said in Caritas in Veritate, every economic decision has a moral consequence, every single one, and we're all implicated in that, from the smallest things to the biggest things. But this is in a sense of the great hope. So to end where I started, we need the political will. We need to change the norms. We need to change the hearts and minds, and we're the only people who can do that ourselves, and also through the pressure we can bear on these big institutions that in our globalized economy today almost seem insurmountable, but they're not. Okay, I'll end on that point. Did I run over? I ran over a little. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks very much, Tony, for your comments, both in terms of summary and extending our thinking and a lot of the powerful messages there in Laudato Si to be extended and thought about. So I think, is that it? So I think we're going to call this to a close. and we have a reception. I don't know if Gerard or Drew have any final comments from the Berkley Center itself.
I should take my stuff. Sure.
I want to thank you all for coming today. We see this as the beginning of a conversation, and that we'll continue. We promise to kind of continue with this theme and investigating what we can do at the Berkley Center to augment the discussion and the activity in this area of environmental responsibility. I want to thank all our speakers. Let's give them a round of applause again. I'd like to thank the Berkley Center staff, especially Carly Henry, for all the work they did to make this possible. It's been a very difficult week for them. This is their 5th event of the week, so they've been really very, very busy. Jared, you want to say something? What's that? Yeah. We want to thank, too, the catering staff for providing us with the food all day long and keeping the coffee and the tea hot, and providing us now with our reception. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So as Drew said, thank you to all for coming, and thank you to all of the staff and people who helped make this happen, and to all of our wonderful speakers, and thank you especially, Anthony, for rounding it off in such a lively way that's left us all with much food for thought. As Drew said also, this is only the beginning of a conversation, and Walter and Drew and myself will put our heads together about how we continue the conversation, not just on these issues, but many of the related issues that were brought up today. And please do keep an eye on the Berkley Center website and sign up for the mailing list so you can find out about future events. And I guess the final thing to say is that the bar is open. Thank you.